Alright, what we're going to do today, we're going to replace a steering knuckle on a 2012 Jeep Compass. I'm Mr. Peterson. I got Coach Wilson with me holding the camera. We're going to go through this. This is our first time doing it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the bracket here off of the brake line, because we're replacing this whole spindle assembly. And I'm using a 13mm 3/8 drive socket and a 3/8 drive ratchet to remove this bolt to get this bracket. I'll show you once I get it off what we're going to do with it. So now we have removed our brake hose assembly with our wheel speed sensor attached to it also. That way when we take this caliper off and the knuckle, we're not going to put any pressure on the lines. Alright, so next I'm going to go ahead and take my brake caliper bolts out. 18mm socket. I believe it's already on the gun here, ready for us. So I'm going to get my 1/2 inch drive gun. I'm going to put a 1/2 inch drive swivel extension and the 18mm 1/2 inch drive socket. Alright, we got our brake assembly off. So now I'm going to get one of our hangers. So we've always discussed we don't want to leave this hanging any stress. So I'm going to put a brake hanger on it. I'm just going to hang it up here on the McPherson strut like so. That way we're not putting any stress or strain on the hoses. So now we can remove our brake rotor. And what we're doing is we have a bad wheel bearing here. Alright, so we're going to replace the whole hub assembly. Wheel bearing 20 ender. Alright, so we need to remove our axle nut, our tie rod ends, our lower ball joints, ball joint bolts, and our knuckle bolts right here. So we'll go ahead and remove our axle nut. It requires a 32mm socket. Put it on our air gun. Here we are. Take our little nut and our washer off. Stick it on the lift arm. We can pull our axle in and out now, so when we take our bolts off and everything, we'll be able to slide our spindle out. So now I'm going to take a 18mm socket again, and I'm going to remove our, sorry coach, I'm going to remove our end link, bolt. Now we have our end link out here. 18mm socket. Once again, 18mm wrench. We have a through bolt down here on the lower ball joint. I'm just going to remove the nut off of here, and I'll slide our bolt through. So the only thing that we have left is we need to remove our control arm from the bottom. I think I'm going to take our strut tower bolts out real fast first and see what kind of play we have. Alright, 21mm socket once again for our strut tower bolts. Take our favorite tool in the shop, our hammer. Just knock the bolts through. And one important thing we want to do before we break it is we want to remove our wheel speed sensor from our hub. So I'm going to take my 10mm 1/4 inch drive set up here, ratchet extension socket, 10mm bolt right here on the back side of this plate, and I'm going to pull my speed sensor out of the hub. That way we don't tear anything up. So now, if you see, I'm free on my McPherson strut. I have my axle loose to where I can slide it out of my spindle, and I have my bolt out of my ball joint down here. So now we just need to work on sliding that axle out all the way. Slide the spindle off the control arm. Now we have our bad part off the car. So our next step is going to be our brand new assembly. We got lucky, we didn't have to do any pressing. The student had bought the whole assembly. So we'll just reverse order, slide the spindle assembly on the lower ball joint, just like so. We'll slide our axle in. Remember, we have splines on the axle right here, splines on the inside of our ball joint, so we want to make sure that slides in nice and fresh. Our axle shaft comes through the ball joint assembly. So the next step is I'm going to take a bolt for the strut tower, push up on the control arm, line my holes up, and I'm going to slide a bolt through. That way we can keep everything in place. So my next thing I'm going to do is start reassembling the tower. Put my lower bolt in. I'll slide my, let's leave the tie rod in off for the time being, because it'll make it easier for us to reinstall the rest of the stuff with that off. What do we do with that other nut? Do we bring it back over here? I don't remember. Put our washer in. Let's put our nut on our axle. Always make sure that the thread's on by hand before we hammer it down. Go ahead and put our brake rotor back on. Looks like we're going to have to do some more surgery. This assembly came bent in the box. We've already beat on it a little bit, so I'm just going to take my hand and kind of bend the shield down a little bit. That way when we put our rotor on, it sits on it nice and flat and it doesn't rub our dust shield. We don't want any riding down the road. So now I'm going to put my lug nut on to hold my brake rotor in place. We'll go ahead and get our caliper slid back on. Get our brake pads lined up. Slide that right in there. Get our hardware for our caliper. Oh, slid off on me. Apparently the shield is not lined up to our holes where it was bent. See if we can adjust that a little bit. There we go. Now our bolts go through our dust shield in the back. Let's try this one more time. There we go. All right. Haven't been in the shop in a couple of days. I'm rusty. Don't hold it against me. So I'm gonna take my air gun, put my 18mm socket back on. Go ahead and spin these bolts tight. We can go ahead and reinstall our wheel speed sensor. Make sure we're putting that in. If we don't put that in, then we won't register any wheel speed and our ABS light will stay on. We don't want that. It's bad news bears. Now that we have all that lined up, put our bracket bolt in. Go ahead and tighten our brake line bracket back down. Keep that hanger out of the way. Tight. Put our wiring harness back in our little alignment hole on our knuckle. So next we're going to put our lower ball joint bolt back in. That's an important part of this job. We don't want our ball joint falling out going down the road. Stick that back in. I'm gonna get my impact gun, whatever I did with the electric one, there it is. And you guys know that battery likes to fall out on us every day. I'll tell you one thing, since you kids been at home, I hadn't dropped any flashlights and had to pick up covers and batteries like we did every day. Been an amazing feat. So I'm going to tighten down my lower ball joint. I'm going to attempt to tighten down our strut tower bolts with this electric gun. We'll see how good it does. And sometimes that will happen. Just take your hammer. This has splines on it, so it'll grab into the housing. Don't do that. Just tap that bolt right through. It'll lock her down in place. Then we can take our gun and hammer it down. I don't believe our gun wants to do the job. So I'll have to turn the air compressor back on, which is going to be loud and obnoxious, but I'll do that after the video. Pretty much we have the rundown of what we did today. I'm going to put my tie rod in back in. I'm going to put my nut on my tie rod in. Once the air compressor gets turned on and build up some air pressure, I'll tighten my tie rod back down, get our control arm, or I mean our strut tower bolts tight, tighten our axle nut, go over everything by hand like we always do, make sure we're nice and tight, and we'll put our tire back on and take it around the parking lot, and hopefully everything's hunky-dory. I appreciate it. We miss you, and hopefully we'll make some more videos. In the meantime, stay safe, stay indoors, and we'll see you.